I'm Tiffany Chapuzio Wong, and this is the third video in the ArubaBots Automate with Ansible series. And in today's video, we're going to be working with variables and variable files in Ansible. So let's get started. First, I'm going to explain the concepts through some slides, and then I'll go through a complete demo. If you'd like to skip to the demo part, feel free to click on the link in the description down below. If you remember from the last video, a variable is essentially a key to represent a value. The name of variables can include letters, numbers, and underscores, but it must always start with a letter. There are three main types of variables in Ansible: Playbook variables, Inventory variables, and Special variables. Variables in playbooks are relatively simple. Here's an example playbook where we have variables defined. To define a variable in a playbook, use the keyword vars before writing your tasks. All variables will be defined single-indented below. Dictionaries are also supported. To define a dictionary, simply indent the key value pairs below the dictionary variable name. In Ansible, you don't have to specify whether a variable is a string or an integer. YAML will handle all that for you. In this example, we have the variables HTTP port, default gateway, and VLANs, an integer, a string, and a dictionary with keys ID and port. When accessing a variable, you'll use these double curly braces to replace the variable with its value. If you start a value with accessing the variable, you'll need to surround the double curly braces with quotations. This is because YAML will attempt to read the double curly braces as a dictionary. In this example, you can see we're passing in the value of default gateway. But since we're only passing in the value, we have to surround the variables with the double quotations. But if you look at port ID, since we're beginning the value with text and not the variable, we don't need the quotations surrounding the braces. Most modules return data after executing. The data return depends on the vendor and how the module was written. For the Aruba switching modules, we typically return the results of the REST API calls. To save the return data into a variable, we use the keyword register followed by the variable name we want the results stored in. Here's an example of how to use register to check the output of a module call. To check the contents of a variable, we can use the debug module to print out the contents of a variable to the CLI during execution. In this case, we're using the var parameter and passing in the response variable. And to the right is an example of the CLI output. We've already kind of seen an example of inventory variables before. Remember, all variables defined in your inventory are available in your playbook during execution. But keep in mind, the variables available are ones that belong to that specific host. In this example, let's say we have the variable default gateway defined for each host in our inventory. When we run the task on the right, for switch 1, the value of default gateway will be the 10.26 address, but for switch 2, the gateway will be the 10.44 address. To keep your inventory and playbooks as neat and tidy as possible, it is recommended to define group and host variables in individual files, and these are called variable files. For group variable files, create a directory named group_vars, and for host variable files, we want to create a directory named host_vars. The files stored in these directories are always YAML formatted and only contain variable definitions. Always be sure that the name of the files match the host or group name that they belong to. In Ansible, variables can be overwritten and are flattened before each play is ran on a specific host. Always keep in mind the precedence Ansible has for variables. With the lowest precedence at the top, we see here we have our inventory file, then inventory group and host variable files, playbook variables and variable files, and lastly, with the highest precedence, extra vars, which I'll show you an example of in the demo. Here's an example of the structure for variable files. Variables can be defined from the parent group all the way to the host variable file. Any variables defined in the host variable file will overwrite any preceding definitions. In this example, when a playbook is executed on the Access 2930 host, the variable TFTP server will have the value defined in the host variable file, but the proxy variable will have the value that was defined in the parent group. Ansible has a list of special variables that are defined by Ansible and cannot be set by the user. These are populated by Ansible at runtime and are available during a play. Here are a few examples. We have inventory host name, group names, and groups. For a complete list, visit Ansible documentation on special variables. So hopefully now you have a clearer understanding of the different types of variables available in Ansible and how to use them. Now, let's see them in action. So since I'm mainly focusing on using variables in this video, I'm going to keep my playbook simple. Here I have a playbook where I'm just creating VLAN 300, but let's say I want this VLAN to be a variable for a particular host. So I'm going to make it an inventory variable. Here's my inventory file, and I'm going to add the variable uplink VLAN and set that equal to 300. Now once that's done, let's change our playbook to use this newly created inventory variable. So now everywhere that you see a 300, I'm just going to go ahead and replace with my uplink VLAN. I can even replace the 300 in the task name. Now you notice if the first thing in the value is the variable, like here, I want to surround the double curly braces with quotations. But if you look like here in the VLAN, I actually don't even need these quotations. So again, if you're ever not sure, you can always put the quotations around the curly braces. If for whatever reason you're missing quotations or anything, or even double curly braces, Ansible will let you know. Now let's go ahead and run the playbook. So in this demo, I'm using a 3810 with a completely blank configuration here. And this is my Ansible control machine. So I'm going to go ahead and run my create VLAN playbook. And just like that, VLAN 300 was created. Now again, an important thing to remember about variables in Ansible is their precedence. Inventory variables have a lower precedence than variables we create in a playbook. So let's see what happens when I create the playbook variable uplink VLAN. So underneath my host line, I'm going to declare vars and create uplink VLAN, and I'm going to set that equal to 200. I'll also create variables for the VLAN IP and mask just because that makes sense to do so. Okay, now I have my uplink VLAN set to 200, and I've created the variables uplink VLAN IP and mask. So now let's go ahead and save and run this again. And as you can see, my playbook variable uplink VLAN overwrote the inventory variable uplink VLAN. And if we take a look at our switch, the VLAN 200 was created. So in Ansible, I mentioned there is also the concept of extra variables. And these are variables passed in through the CLI. And these have the highest precedence than any other type of variables that you'll see in Ansible. So let's go ahead and see how they work. Without changing any code in the playbook, I'm going to rerun the create VLAN playbook, but pass in different values for the variables I have set. To pass in extra variables, just use the -e or --extra vars option, followed by your variables in an INI-like format surrounded in quotes. So here, I'm going to go ahead and set my uplink VLAN to 400, as well as give it a different uplink VLAN IP. And I hit enter, and there you go. You can already see that the VLAN variable is my new one. And if I do a show run, you can see that I have VLAN 400 created. This probably isn't the best example of using extra variables, since most likely you'd be keeping this information in your inventory on a per host or probably group basis. But what it can be useful for are passing in variables for things like the host you're going to run on, or even changing the behavior of the playbook. The VLAN module allows for a parameter called config, and when it's set to delete, it'll actually delete the configuration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called config. So now I'm going to modify my playbook to use the variable config, and by default I'm just going to have it be create. So if I run this playbook again, we'll see we get an OK status that VLAN 400 is already there. But let's say I set config equal to delete. And now if I take a look at my switch, you can see that VLAN 400 is deleted. So I mentioned variable files are the best way to organize your inventory variables. Now let's say I have two 3810s, but I don't want to have to repeat the same variables for each host. So what I'm going to do is modify my inventory file to just describe the relationships of my devices. Then I'll use variable files to define the connection information as well as other information for my hosts. So I'm going to modify my inventory file to add a group called aos-switches. And the hosts belonging to that group will be switch 1, and did this again, switch 1 and switch 2. So now that I've modified my inventory file, I need to go ahead and create my group variable files and my host variable files for all of these devices. So going to my control machine, in the same directory that you have your inventory file, you want to create the directories group vars and host vars. Let's go to CD. And now I'm going to create the file for my aos-switches group. So I'm going to create aos-switches.yaml. Again, it's very important that you keep this name of the file the same name as either the groups or the host that you're going to keep. So here in my aos-switches group variable file, I'm going to add the variables that are going to be common between both the devices. Save that. And now I have to create the host variable files for both of my switches. So first one is going to be switch 1. Now remember, because these are variable files, you don't have to declare vars in the file. Ansible already knows that these contain variables. And I'm just going to make switch 2 very similar. Since this is 23, have it be 600 and 60. That should be fine. Okay, so now I have my host variable file set. I have my group variable file set. So now I just have to change my playbook to make sure it runs on both devices. Here I have a couple of options. I can use the keyword all, and that'll if you remember, that'll basically have Ansible attempt to run this playbook on all of the devices that I have in my inventory. But let's say I just want to do the group aos-switches. I'm going to remove these playbook variables since everything's going to be defined in our inventory. And now let's rerun the playbook. Oh, so I have my second 3810 here. You can see it has just a blank configuration, and then I have my original 3810 here. I'm going to actually change the IP address. I'm actually going to change this to be, let's do 400 instead. Okay. Now actually I'm going to reset this, make it a little bit more clear. So I'm not going to run any extra variable or put any extra vars or anything like that. And I run it, and you can already see that it's running on the entire group. And if we go here to our switches, I should see my VLAN 600 created here. And I show run, and I have now my new VLAN 400 created again. And you can see that VLANs were created on both switches in respect to the values that they had stored in their inventory. So before I end today's video, I wanted to show you a few troubleshooting techniques that I realized were missing from my playbooks video. The first one, I mentioned it earlier, is the debug module. And this acts very similar to like a print statement. And it'll output either a message or a value to the screen depending on what you're trying to debug. So let's get back to our playbook here. So let's say, for example, you're trying to configure this uplink VLAN IP, and the value for the address isn't what you're actually expecting. What you can do is use the debug module with the var parameter, and that'll basically print out the contents of that variable. When you pass in the variable, you don't have to surround it with the double quotations or the curly braces. You simply just have to enter in the variable name. In addition to outputting the contents of a variable, you could also use the debug module to output statements. So now if I run the playbook again, you can see the output of the information on the screen. Another really useful troubleshooting technique is running the playbook in what's called verbose mode. And you can do this by adding the -v option to your Ansible command. Verbose mode just tells Ansible to output more information to the screen during runtime. And you can add more V's to the option to increase verbosity. As you can see, a lot of information is outputted to the screen. Well, that's it for today's video. I hope you learned more about all the awesome things you can do with variables in Ansible. If you have any questions, don't forget to visit us on our Airheads developer community. Link is in the description down below. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.